coming in, but let's start because we're already somewhat behind schedule. Let me introduce you to session 2, Georgia's Unresolved Conflicts. Is there any room for manoeuvre? I'm your moderator. Donnacha Beacháin is my name, from Dublin City University in Ireland, where I'm a professor of politics at the School of Law and Government in Dublin City University. Just to add a few words from my own part, I first came to Georgia 20 years ago now. It was a very, very different Georgia. I remember well the 4 hours of electricity that we had to endure like all the other people in Tbilisi at the time. And really, it's a source of great pleasure for me to come back as frequently as I do and to see the transformation that has occurred in Georgia during the 20 years. It's really unrecognizable. Indeed, this hotel, as many will remember, was housing hundreds of families, refugees from Abkhazia. And now it's a rather splendid institution where we all gather here today. And of course, since I first came to Georgia, the European Union has almost doubled in size. And it's indeed, I think, no exaggeration to say it's the greatest peace project in modern times. And it's, I think, the earnest hope of many people here, including myself, that Georgia one day will very soon, hopefully, join this community of nations. So some things have changed in the last 20 years. Unfortunately, some things have remained the same, or indeed perhaps gone into reverse. The state of relations between Georgians and Abkhaz and Ossetians is amongst those things that have remained a constant. The negative relations, I should add. I first visited Abkhazia in the autumn of 2000 when it was then the United Nations mission in Georgia that were providing transport. Unfortunately, they are no longer present, as many of you know, and things have really exacerbated since then. We are no strangers to conflict in my own native country of Ireland. And it's worth highlighting that when Ireland and Britain joined the European Union in 1972, it was then called the European Economic Community, 500 people were killed in violent conflict in Northern Ireland. 500. Now, the population of Northern Ireland then would have been about the size of Greater Tbilisi today. So that gives you some sense of the intensity of the conflict. 500 people died. About 10,000 shooting and bombing incidents occurred during that year, 1972. But the European Union common EU membership for Britain and Ireland transformed relations within Northern Ireland, between the two parts of Ireland and between Britain and Ireland. And again, it's my hope that Georgia will one day be able to benefit from this wonderful peace project that is the European Union. Unfortunately, it's presently threatened by Brexit. We won't go there. But I think that one thing that we've learned in the British Isles, in the Caucasus, is that exclusionary forms of nationalism have proved to be the enemy of conflict resolution and of reconciliation. And that brings us to our topic today. As I said, Georgia's Unresolved Conflicts. Is there room for manoeuvre? We have a wonderful panel assembled to discuss this. Our panelists, let me introduce them in turn. We have on my left here, Ketevan Tsikhelashvili, the State Minister of Reconciliation and Civic Equality. We have on my far right here, I say that geographically, of course, not politically, Toivo Klaar, the EU Special Representative to the South Caucasus, originally from Estonia. We have, to my left here, Varvara, Pakhomenko, head of mission in Ukraine, Geneva call. And to my right here, we have Natalia, Mirimanova, independent conflict resolution expert based in Brussels. And I've been advised by the organizers that since we've started about 15 minutes late, we will finish about 15 minutes late, so lunch is slightly postponed, but only by 15 minutes. And that the format should be as follows, that each panelist would speak for perhaps about 7, maximum 10 minutes, and then there will be some follow-up questions moderated by myself, and then I would throw the discussion open to the audience based on this wonderful application we have here, this slido.com. I have the computer here in front of me, so I'll be looking to see what questions are emerging from the audience, and I'll also be looking for a demonstration of hands from people who want to contribute. And then, of course, we will conclude. So on that note, I invite our first speaker, the Minister for Reconciliation and Civic Equality, to address us.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, dear guests of Georgia, ambassadors, good friends, the Georgian audience, to all of you panelists. And thank you for the invitation. I just made a comment with media that I really see a great value in discussing the security issues in the South Caucasus annually, because it's our daily job. So it's not only once a year exercise indeed. And unfortunately, we're not free of security challenges. And you just made an overview of 20 years. So many things changed, but indeed there are some things that unfortunately didn't change, and we have an unresolved conflict for more than a quarter of a century, in fact, now, and over a decade of ongoing Russian occupation. That's a major challenge to my country. And it's indeed a very long time, especially for people who are the internally displaced community, including the people who used to live in this house, who are now accommodated in their temporary residences, but who are still barred from an access to their homes. And they have been, as you know, they are overwhelmingly Georgian, and the majority of the original pre-conflict population. Unfortunately, the softly saying kind of deep Georgianization of the occupied regions still goes on. It involves fighting against Georgian identity or Georgianness as well as Georgian traits. It comes hardest on people, a few number of Georgians who still live in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in districts called Gali and Akhalgori, who unfortunately are basically discriminated for their ethnicity, the only community inside these regions who are deprived the possibility of native language instruction since a few years now. Or property rights or possibilities of employment, difficulties with crossing, etc., and so on. It also involves, for instance, obliteration of some kinds of some sites of Georgian cultural heritage, or our joint heritage, if you wish, and it has been more rampant in the course of previous years. It's one of the discussion topics now in Geneva international talks that Ambassador Klaar knows very well. So, and he's actually chairing, is one of the co-chairs of these discussions. But also sometimes as blunt as, simply eradicating the trace of some of the Georgian villages, like it was done in the South Ossetia, Tsikhelashvili region. There was, and still is, I think, on internet, a picture visualizing this from satellite shots from 2007 and 2017, showing like 15 formerly settled Georgian villages and now showing no trace of life anymore, which is, of course, very sad. But and tragic, not only sad, this is a big challenge. But in fact, this is a part of a larger strategy of Russification that may come hardest on Georgians, but it really endangers all the communities on the ground, including Abkhazians and Ossetians, and this is more and more feelable year by year. So is the criticism, basically, especially in Abkhazia, that is directed towards Russia and its Russification policy. It results in isolation and social economic hardships, and unfortunately, dismissal for human rights, very hard humanitarian situation. And it's no surprise that if we kind of apart from IDPs, you still have a very major depopulation of these regions, so up to 70%, 65 in Abkhazia, and over 80% in South Ossetia, Tsikhelashvili region. Now you have like 20,000 people living there, as compared to over 100,000 in the last Soviet census when the conflict broke out in 1989. So this is a picture, and the only population that grows population are the Russian military. Only yesterday, in Russian media, they have taken a stock of what was done in the course of last 5 years, and how many facilities have been built, over 50 in Abkhazia, including the block houses for Russian soldiers and their families. We're now talking at times up to 10,000 soldiers, especially when there are military maneuvers and drills. Their number last year was over 130. And if you mind the geography and the size of these regions, that's really dramatic. It's a lot of drills and maneuvers that turns them into a military theater, or let's say, in the case of Tsikhelashvili, it's more feelable like a military enclave, because it's landlocked on the top of being isolated by the barbed wires. So basically, if we want to look even wider, that's a part of Russia's strategy of dividing and trying to rule. So to secure this exclusive presence on ground, the strategy is to isolate, not to allow international presence, like for instance from UMM, and to deepen the divides as much as possible. And as we are celebrating these days the 10th anniversary of the Eastern Partnership, I say that pretty often, and I will repeat because it helps visualize the whole strategy. If you look at this Eastern Partnership area, which is a shared neighborhood now between the European Union and Russia, you see 5 countries that suffer unresolved conflict out of 6, which is of course not by chance. In all of them, Russia is present in some way, mostly quite common scenarios and instruments. And these conflicts in an unresolved state are instrumentalized or leveraged for the influence. This is a reality that we have. On ground, it takes the shape of barbed wires. We have 100 kilometers of that now splitting over 100 villages. We're talking about 14,000 households who face barbed wires every single day. We're talking about detentions of locals who try to actually reach their lands, but in fact they happen to cross the occupation line. And notably, in the course of last 3 years, I can even give you some statistics, there is a dramatic increase in the detention of the people who live on the occupied side, trying to reach the Georgian-controlled side, attempting to kind of come to the rest of Georgia. If you had, like, in 2016, twice as many people from occupied side detained by the Russian soldiers, in 2017 you had 3 times more. In 2018 you had already 5 times more, for instance, detained from Tsikhelashvili region in attempt somehow to sneak, because this movement is related to their life important needs. Despite these restrictions, people still make to come over, overcoming, some difficulties, or going to Russia and coming to the rest of Georgia, 6 times more resort to the healthcare services that Georgian state provides for free to the residents of both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It's not the only service, though, but it kind of gives a picture of how the contacts grow, and in parallel, how the barriers grow. Sometimes it takes the shape of additional restrictions, new documentation. For instance, most recently, to the residents of Tsikhelashvili, South Ossetia, a need for a KGB pass to come to the rest of Georgia. That's a practice that has been already in place in Abkhazia since a while. So at the end of the day, you have this freedom of movement that is curbed by all means, including by closure of the crossing points. We also had like 6 crossing points in the direction of Abkhazia, and 4 of them have been, in the course of last 3 years, shut down. Not because that they were not populated or used, they were exactly crossed and populated with increasing number of people. So strategies, unfortunately, are very clear. In the beginning of this year, we had a full closure of all crossings. Only exceptions were the people who had the very urgent medical needs, those involved in cancer treatment or so, especially in the direction of Abkhazia, for 1 month, and for 2 months in the direction of Tsikhelashvili, South Ossetia. My understanding of it was clear. I read it as a part of this division strategy. The alleged pretext or reason was a fear for the spread of the flu, a seasonal flu called H1N1, or colloquially called the swine flu, which was, by the way, already present inside these regions. And I was not surprised at all when some statements arrived pretty shortly after disclosure on 10th of January, especially from de facto South Ossetian side, that blamed all on the Lugar laboratory placed in Tbilisi, the spread of this flu. And letting alone absurdity of the contents of this allegation, there is a mismatch in the calendar, because this flu was pandemic in Europe, by the way, also in Georgia, in 2009, while the Lugar laboratory was started to function some years later. But who cares? It's a part of misinformation, propaganda, which is also used as an invisible barrier or the instrument to deepen these divisions, construct and constantly feed the image of enemy, constantly feed the stereotypes that would hamper people from contact. And now I come in the concluding part to our strategy. Exactly for these reasons, because it affects lives and it takes a hostage of the interest, the rational interest of the people, our strategy is to do twice as many or twice as much or 3 times as much, whatever is needed, to bridge these barriers, the artificial barriers that are now to split the people. So to help the lives, to build the bridges, and to pave the way to conflict transformation is a motto of our peace policy. And in this spirit, last year, we have launched a new peace plan called A Step to a Better Future that captures 3 major dimensions. One is to facilitate trade across the dividing line, as we see trade as a rational and powerful anchor of peace with potentially vested interest from, tentatively speaking, both sides or maybe more sides than 2, that can help build the cooperation around the shared interest. The second is about, granting more education opportunities to the residents of the occupied territories, because we believe it's an investment in future that we are all striving to. And generally, the third is to ease the access to different services that Georgian state provides to the rest of its citizens. In most of it, and the novelty of this peace plan is that we suggest totally new, more creative, I would say, real instruments which are status neutral. So they kind of put aside the status. We don't change our attitudes to status-related issues, but it kind of purposefully puts the status issues aside to pave the way for humanitarian solutions. It's purely constructive, so it's kind of win-win. It's not against anybody. And it does have a power and potential to generate these dynamics in a peace process because it is backed up by a real instruments in life. I give you an example. For instance, to resort to some of the services, no need to take the citizenship. Basically, electronic identification by those residents who don't have the legitimate documents of identification is enough. And several services, such as starting a business, doing economic activity on the other side of divide, engaging themselves in trade, benefiting from the tax exemptions that we also introduced by this peace plan, that all becomes available. And not only, also education opportunities. So we have launched it in the parliament. Last year, the parliament's majority has supported it fully, so 9 laws have been amended, and we completed the harmonization of sub-laws actually this April. So very last legislative instruments were put in place in April. We also started some other concrete mechanisms that were foreseen by this plan. For instance, some 3-4 weeks ago, we launched a new pre-high education center that gets the applications from the students of the 2 occupied territories and offers them eased entry at the higher education systems in the rest of Georgia, also professional schools. So we have already 140 students, by the way, who started right away with this program, and which actually widens this opportunity. It's not the only instrument because it also involves possibilities for studies abroad, but that has been functional. What I also would like to single out is perhaps a new program that for the first time in 25 years makes financial resources available to the residents of the two regions to conduct economic activities as related to trade. It's a grant program called Enterprise for a Better Georgia, Better Future, which means Better Georgia. And it offers grants to the residents of the 2 territories from 7 to 35,000 lari. These are small, but already, trust me, there are so many applications that we got from the residents of the 2 regions that I think there would be a high competition. Actually, today is the closing date for the first round. We are now putting in place the Peace Fund. Many of our international partners know about that. We're working hard to kind of make it really, really functional and bring all the expectations or all the procedures and requirements from different potential partners together and in place to back up this initiative even more meaningfully and to diversify the platforms of dialogue as related to trade, education, or many other directions that may, at the end of the day, serve the interests of the population. It was widely supported internationally, but for me, the most important thing was that it was immediately supported and got a feedback from Abkhazians and Ossetians who found their way to communicate tacitly their interests, and it still goes on. Obviously, this gives us a very clear picture that there is an interest, that there is a willingness, and now we need to do two things. And this is my plea to the rest of the international community. Work on the high level, diplomatic level, or with all the instruments as we already do with our dear friends and co-chairs in Geneva or elsewhere to kind of persuade or pressure Russia not to obstruct it directly. That is enough. So we don't need too much facilitation, just not to obstruct it directly. And second is to invest more in people-to-people contacts, because this is the direct investment in durable peace. And we see this peace plan as kind of a roadmap or a concrete instrument now how to do that. So investing in the fund or doing any other activities that would help people commute on both sides, from both sides, is something that we call an investment in reconciliation. This is a major line of our policy, and I conclude by saying that we indeed are not going to reconcile with the status quo that Russia today is trying to impose, but we are doing all to reconcile the people who are split by the conflict and who are now split by the artificial barriers. I believe that is the very meaningful process also for European security, and as we will probably hand over then to you, Special Representative, I conclude by recalling quite a landmark resolution of the European Union 10 years after Russian invasion and aggression in Georgia that clearly says, like many other partners, that investing or peaceful conflict resolution in Georgia is also a matter of European security, and it's investment in the European security. So we look forward, we are doing our best, and yeah, that's it. So I'm ready for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And I now pass us over to Toivo Klaar, the EU Special Representative to the South Caucasus.
There's a button down there. Hello. Okay. So, thank you very much, and thank you for having me at this conference. So, to pick up where the minister left off, of course, this is a abnormal situation that we're in. These unresolved conflicts mean that the rights and needs of thousands and hundreds of thousands of conflict-affected people remain unaddressed. And in particular, of course, the lot of the displaced people is particularly difficult. And we were mentioning this very building being housing many of them some time ago. These disputes also mean that many transport and economic links remain disrupted, and the rich potential of the region and of its people cannot develop fully. Above all, these conflicts continue to pose a permanent threat to the security of the entire region. And of course, from the EU side, it is obvious, as the minister mentioned, this is not about Georgia only or about the region only, it's also about security for the European Union. And that is why the EU has been heavily involved in peace efforts in Georgia. At the height of the war in 2008, the EU acted as a mediator between Georgia and Russia to prevent further escalation. And this ultimately resulted in a cessation of hostilities. Since then, we have been a central actor in the process to manage the consequences and to improve the lives of conflict-affected people. First, the EU maintains the only large international monitoring presence in the field, the UMM. And this mission fulfills an indispensable function of stabilization to the benefit of all the communities affected by the conflict. Second, the EU is co-chairing, together with the OSCE and the UN, the Geneva international discussions, which address the consequences of the conflict and involve all stakeholders. And this is the only forum where all the actors concerned can meet and work together to strengthen security and to try to find solutions. And third, of course, the EU is and continues to pursue a clear non-recognition and engagement policy with the breakaway regions. We are keen to include the entities in our assistance programs whenever this is possible. We are also supporting civil society initiatives in the entities, as well as activities that can help to re-establish confidence across the divides, such as people-to-people contacts, dialogue processes, and academic exchanges. So, where are we 10 years after the 2008 conflict? On the one hand, with the GID, we have managed to build a crucial platform for discussions based on broad inclusiveness, as I mentioned. Because of this, the GID is an efficient and indispensable crisis management and conflict resolution tool. Or rather, I should perhaps say conflict prevention tool, because resolution is some ways off. But over the years, we have managed to identify sources of tension and issues of concern and interest. And we have been able to discuss many of these. The debates are also an opportunity for the three co-chairing organizations to remind participants that the unresolved disputes have a very negative impact on the people of the two entities, elsewhere in Georgia and in the entire region. We have managed in these discussions to identify a series of humanitarian-related problems, which, if they are addressed in a pragmatic and result-oriented manner, could help improve the environment in which the conflict-affected people live. These problems relate to crossings, life cycle documents, language of instruction, property rights, access to public health, livelihoods, and, of course, not least important, the fate of missing persons. The good thing is that 10 years after the conflict and 10 years after the establishment of the Geneva International Discussions, all participants remain committed to the process. This is in itself positive and encouraging. On the other hand, I cannot hide that we are stuck with the substance of our discussions. And you know that very well here. Progress is limited, in particular when we address the core topics of the Geneva discussions and the Geneva mandate, which are improved modalities for security and stability and issues related to internally displaced persons and refugees. Russia is probably the only actor involved who is satisfied with the current situation. It has now for a very long time been able to deploy military forces in the entities, and they control crossings. The decision by Russia to recognize the entities and to station military and security forces there remains the major stumbling block to conflict resolution. And that was very well mentioned by the minister. The EU has firmly condemned these steps. These are illegal and unconstructive. The state of affairs is highly frustrating, and we do not see Russia showing any signs of reversing its action in the short term, nor of showing flexibility on security-related issues. In addition, Russia's approach to security tends to restrict the concept to hard security at the expense of human security. As a result, the GID is in reality more about preventing the conflict from reigniting and about managing crisis situations or incidents than it is about resolving the conflict. At the same time, and despite the frustrations, we should not underestimate the crucial importance of the GID. Together with the UMM presence and its activities, the GID makes a major contribution to stability. And we also see that the overall security situation is relatively stable and manageable, with all the caveats that I mentioned. There is sometimes a fear that as the GID contributes to stabilize the situation, it could also lead to a normalization of the current status quo. But I don't agree with this. For me, the GID makes it possible to highlight, and to highlight 4 times a year, that the current status quo is abnormal, it is unacceptable, and it is not sustainable. But there's another aspect to the role of the GID. The relative stability which the GID is contributing to is crucial for the development of Georgia's economy and democracy. And this development can positively impact on the conflict dynamics, as it can make it attractive for people in the entities to engage across the divides. And this is precisely where I see this room for that is being asked about. As I see it, and as I mentioned, Russia's interest in the entities is above all about hard security. Russia is also providing basic infrastructure and subsidies, but these are tools for maintaining a military presence. There is no vision and support towards human development in general. That gives Georgia a major comparative advantage in the eyes of ordinary people in the entities. Of course, this is a long-term project. But in this context, and the minister talked about this, the EU has praised the initiative of a step to a better future. And we have expressed the readiness to support its further design and implementation. We share the view that the unresolved conflicts should not be approached as if they were just about territories. They are about people. It is primarily about people in these territories and about reaching out to their hearts and to their minds. But of course, there are obstacles and traps along the way. Most of these obstacles are well known. There are increased barriers and difficulties of crossing the dividing lines, as well as the increasing influence that security structures are having over people in the entities. But in addition, there are security fears that many people in the entities have, as well as concerns about their identity, and for various reasons. People do see Russia as a security provider, whereas Georgia means for them insecurity. This is the legacy of the conflict, which we all know did not start in 2008. These obstacles need to be addressed in order for Georgia to effectively use the growing comparative advantage it has over Russia in offering people in the entities opportunities to fully develop their potential. Georgia can truly shine this great light into these entities and has a huge potential with its development that the people in the entities cannot take advantage of. But for this to happen, all these aspects have to be addressed. And so for that reason, there need to be even more contacts across the dividing lines, including among civil society actors and professionals, and also based on status-neutral formulas with, I believe, the de facto authorities. In conclusion, let me stress that the emergence of other crises, such as Ukraine, does not divert the EU from Georgia or even diminish the EU's engagement there. Indeed, our firm commitment to to support peace efforts and conflict resolution in Georgia remains as strong as ever, as is symbolized by the fact that the UMM is here in as great numbers as ever. The EU is as engaged in the Geneva discussions as ever. And on a political level, we are taking up Georgia's file at every opportunity, also with the Russians. So I think the concern sometimes that is expressed that other conflicts have somehow diminished attention to Georgia, and because there's a relative stability, that is not true. I think there are opportunities here, and I think together we can make use of them. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Klaar. And I pass this over now to our next speaker. That's Varvara Pakhomenko.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. First time I arrived to South Ossetia, to Tsikhelashvili, it was in August of 2008. That time I was trying just to monitor all of the violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and over the next few years trying to assist the victims of this conflict on the both sides of a dividing line. I witnessed different violations. Right to life being violated, distinction between civilian and military objects, enforced disappearances and abduction of people and arrests and whatsoever. For the last 3 years, I've been working in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. And I witnessed almost all the same, just in the larger scale. Just probably because it's a larger region, much larger. And if before while we were talking about violation of rights of the people living in South Ossetia or Abkhazia and didn't quite understand how to address it, and I will come to this later, we were talking about dozens of thousands and hundreds of people. Now, with the emergence of so-called DNR and LNR in 2014, we have already a few million people living in so-called non-government controlled territories in the territory of post-Soviet space. It's a huge number. And it's still quite unclear how to deal with the issues of human rights and international humanitarian law in these territories. There is no any recognized government which controls them. That's why they're not government controlled. And we used to perceive the idea of human rights that it's a government which shall provide these rights or protect the freedoms of people living there. But how can we, and now it's more and more, Ukraine and Georgia is not the only region in the world which faces this problem. According to recent war report by Geneva Academy, it's 51 conflict in the world out of 69 non-international. It means they involve are non-state actors. Many of them control territories where millions of people live. And this number is growing. In 2014, so 5 years ago, there were just 29 of those. And I think this Georgian example and how Georgia handles this issue is a good case to study and understand how we all should move forward. Of course, the territory is a state which, even when it doesn't control the territory, still has an obligation toward human rights of the people living in there. And we should really support the efforts taken by the government of Georgia, Ombudsman Office and the Office of Reconciliation of the country, trying to assist people living in these territories. Then, of course, we talk about the obligations of countries which de facto controlling or have an effective control over the territories. This obligation stated in the different international treaties, and they are for both IHL, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. And we have a number of European courts of human rights decisions about this. But when it comes to the armed non-state actors, it can be de facto authorities, it can be sometimes just armed groups. What to do with them? And in all the international legislation and all the international treaties, we have a very limited numbers of them which just refer at all to these actors. It would be a second additional protocol to Geneva Conventions, or Geneva Conventions themselves, which this year we celebrate 70th anniversary of them. And only one article in this Geneva Conventions is talking about armed non-state actors, while, as I told you, majority of the conflicts now about them. Shall we engage them? That's what was mentioned by the EU representative here, that probably there is a need sometimes to engage de facto authorities. And considering that, again, under the different treaties, they do have an obligations towards people living there. But we immediately getting under the threat to fall in the trap of legitimization. I believe, and the organization I work with in Geneva Call, which is primarily goal of this organization is the protection of civilians in the situation of the conflict, that these groups do have an obligations, and engaging them doesn't mean legitimization. When we engage them either on the humanitarian norms, we talk about right to life, we talk about right to education, we talk about protection of children and women, and so on. And in the last week report of UN Secretary General on protection of civilians, he stressed that once again the need to engage with non-state actors on terms of protection of civilians. But how can we stay impartial in this? I think this is a challenge and issue for everyone, not only for civil society organizations, but for states themselves. States also. First of all, if the states try to address human rights issues in the non-government controlled territories, how to not fall into the trap of legitimization, how to not be accused by maybe some radical elements in the country that they are going too far. And this, I think, selecting the very impartial approach, focusing on the most needed issues, is the key. Working maybe through partners who are seen as impartial, like international organizations, maybe sometimes non-governmental organizations might help. For us in Geneva Call, we developed a specific approach to trying to engage the armed non-state actors. We developed the documents called so-called deed of commitment, where the non-state actor is proposed to publicly take a commitment by signing the document that they are going to follow some specific rules, whether it's about the protection of children and education, or it's about the problem of anti-personal mines, which is a big issue for the region, or protection of women. From now on, it's more than 100 different armed groups across the world have signed this deed of commitment, publicly committing to do so. Does it really bound them? It's a good question. Of course, we don't have troops to send on the ground, or don't have our own prosecutor office to control them. But we're now facing more and more of a problem that states themselves who signed the different international treaties are not always bound by them, not always implement them. And if we now would discuss probably once again whether all the states would, 70 years after, be able to sign Geneva Conventions now, I'm very much of doubt of this. That's why I think it's very important to start talking and working step by step, and talking to each and every group which are ready to talk about the protection of civilians, whether it's de facto authorities, whether it's just an armed group which can control the territory or don't. Then we, as an organization, we used to engage the authorities from Tsikhelashvili and Sukhumi prior to the 2008 conflict, and on the issue of anti-personal mines. I believe that making all groups as much bound by even the public commitment as possible would help. And also it was mentioned here that the conflicts now more and more have a hybrid nature. So probably we need to try a way to find a coding response to this. We also, as an organization, use different tools quite a lot, working in the communication, with the communication tools and information tools. using different social media and mobile applications to educate people on all sides of the conflict line, on their rights, but also on the obligations for the weapon bearers, for officials. What are their obligations towards civilians? In Ukraine, we launched just 2 months ago the mobile application calling War Has Rules 2, and over 15,000, mostly fighters, as we can now track it, downloaded it on both sides of the conflict line. So we can see that there is a demand and there is a need of people to understand better what's their rights, what's their obligations, whether and when it can give some results, it's another question. But I think it's an issue of working together, of international organization, non-state, non-governmental organization, and the state. Thank you.
Thank you. And that brings us to our final speaker, Natalia Mirimanova.
Does it work? Yeah. Thank you very much. It's very pleasant to be in this nice company. I would like to tell you an anecdote which I think was the best, illustrates the best the story, the history of the conflicts in Georgia and between different people who lived in Georgia. It happened in 1999. In the UN headquarters in New York, where we took Abkhaz and Georgian teenagers immediately affected by the war. It was a very interesting 2-year-long project, and there were kids whose parents died in the war or who were displaced. And we had a meeting there with a Russian diplomat, in fact, who really offended the Abkhaz, and he was saying things that a diplomat or a human being should have never said. And the group that was sort of growing closer together found itself at the verge of a collapse. And the person who rescued the situation was the Georgian representative in the United Nations at the time. He sat addressing the audience, the kids. He sat we the adults, your parents and grandparents, we handled this conflict in the worst possible way, and we're very sorry that we left this legacy to you to resolve. I think that it was, in my view, it was one of the best analysis and in terms of human touch, in terms of honesty, and in terms of realism of what has happened in the early 90s. Indeed, these conflicts that we're talking about today and that affect our lives today in the most immediate way, were a type of conflicts when the empires collapsed. And none of the politicians at the time had indeed any experience, any tools, any instruments, or any resources, I would even say, in early 90s to somehow handle this conflict so that they wouldn't go out of hand. The worst has happened, which is war. And this is usually a turning point in any kind of a dispute, nationalist dispute, religious dispute, political dispute, when bloodshed and blood becomes a divider in itself. And this is a very dangerous moment. Unfortunately, bloodshed happened not once here. So we're dealing indeed with a very difficult, very difficult situation, and I can only commend the recent efforts by the Georgian government, and I was very happy to contribute in a way to that in terms of engaging with people who are on the other side. I don't know how to define it better, but are somewhere beyond, right? But we need to bear in mind that people we are talking to now, or the Georgian government is talking to now, or receiving feedback, it's already next or even probably third generation, yeah, of people who lived in this kind of a conflict. And this is important to bear in mind because, you know, the contexts where people grow here and in the territories that do not really fit into the international system, that are outside of many global developments, right? They grow in very different contexts. I think that indeed these contact between people, between individuals, is the only clear way to move forward because of the number of political obstacles that we have here. And I would like to, from my experience of 25 years working on the Georgian-Abkhaz conflict and other conflicts in the region and elsewhere, I can say that there is no silver bullet, there is no remedy. Even the policy of engagement without recognition has its clear limitations that we see, let's say, in the case of Cyprus. In many, many years, in decades, the engagement without recognition that was pursued by the UN and the European Union has led only to the intransigence of the Republic of Cyprus, for instance, and inflexibility of the proponents of the independent Turkish state of Cyprus. It has to do with the design of this policy of engagement without recognition, because very often the emphasis is on the non-recognition more than on the engagement. How to find a perfect balance, I cannot tell you. We can experiment, but I just wanted to highlight that there is no sure and guaranteed way to get it all. We speak often about trust, right, and confidence, which in the end is the key in the resolution of the conflict. And again, you know, if we talk about Cyprus, for instance, the collapse of the properly designed bilateral talks in Crans-Montana in 2017 were precisely because of the lack of confidence. All the possible instruments are at the disposal of Cypriots on both sides. All resources, like the Republic of Cyprus is a member of the European Union, the path ahead is shining and clear, and yet there is no confidence, because every side is trying to get 100%, which never happens. So we are trying and testing and experimenting. The key thing is to avoid violence, and for that, I think it's very important to mobilize all possible resources. What is good about the context in Georgia is that multiple actors are involved, and this is very important. The downside is lack of coordination, and we always complain about that, but the advantage is that each actor, be it international or domestic, brings its own value added. European Union is exactly as our moderator said, is a peace process, is peace project, right? A successful peace project. It is you know, sort of a proven, a living proof that countries and states that were always at war with each other can live peacefully and progress together, right? The United Nations has its own advantage as the key, the most powerful still organization in the world that guarantees human rights and other rights and humanitarian development, etc., etc. Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is also a very important actor here because it actually was born out of the dream that even outside the European Union there can be a peaceful community, which has been challenged in a very brutal way in the last decade. And also international NGOs that bring precisely this flexibility that intergovernmental organizations may be lacking, right? So this multiplicity of actors that are involved in the Georgian context is a plus, is very important. Now, we also need to be very mindful of the deficiencies of international instruments and mechanisms that we have, and we know they're often applied differently to different situations. Let me put it this way. For instance, the position of the European Union on the dispute between Serbia and Kosovo is very different than its position on the disputes here in Georgia that involve Georgian breakaways republics. The European Union says clearly whatever Serbs and Kosovars decide between themselves will be fine with us. While in other cases, European Union has a different stance. It also has historical conditions and circumstances and everything. But I just want to highlight that we are operating, all of us, and living, which is even more important, right, in a very complex and very difficult and very, I would say, unpredictable context. Local, national, but also global. the belief, the dream that the world is flat and we're all one global village seems to have waned a little bit. And it's not only Russia's fault, but such as the climate, the political climate in the world today. So perhaps today we're in the low of the geopolitical harmony in the world, which affects us very much and affects the Georgian conflicts very much. And I would say, if many believe that Georgia is an arena of geopolitical conflict, then the breakaway republics are an instrument in this geopolitical conflict, which is not a role to be desired. I will conclude here, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Natalia. And I'm looking at the clock here. I see we have about 20 minutes, which I want to devote, of course, largely to the questions that have been circulating here, and some of you have kindly contributed some questions. I noticed that quite a lot of the questions are focusing on issues which might generally be termed human rights in the areas that are not under the control of the government here in Tbilisi, or if it's in the case of Ukraine, in Kiev. And it leads me to a question, since we have the minister here and we have the EU special representative. There was a report on human rights in Abkhazia commissioned by the European Union in 2017, I believe it was, and which was quite critical of how human rights are respected in Abkhazia. It looked at things like prison conditions and gender issues and whatnot. And as I understand it, it was reported in the media that even though it was widely understood that this report would be published, that at the request of the Georgian government, this report was not published, that the EU essentially acceded to the request of the Georgian government. So since I have the minister here, maybe you might be explaining why the Georgian government was uncomfortable with this report, and the EU, why, since it was the EU's report, why it just didn't go ahead and publish it as it had planned.
Well, thank you. First of all, let me compliment the audience to pick up on the human rights, and this is a very critical issue. Indeed so, and this is something that is a main line of designing the peace policy also. It's very human-centric. It was many times said here by the panelists that it's about people, and it's good that, the sensitivity in the audience is, what does it make for the people, and what are the implications for the people. The report that you have been talking about was actually made in the course of a few months by a very well-respected and very well-known, also personally to me, expert, based on the several trips that was done in Abkhazia for this very purpose, and commissioned by the, as I was still the part of the GID, by the GID team, including under the auspices of the European Union. And many of the, well, basically the whole content, part of it that is about the human rights was capturing those major aspects of concerns that are now inside Abkhazia. I cannot exactly answer you what was very communication, what could be the format of that, because this falls beyond my capacity as an agency or the ministry. So I wouldn't be the one to be asked about, where it could be utilized, published, etc., and so on. But the most important thing, it was published. It could still be resorted, unfortunately, as the only and other source who had an opportunity of an access to the territory, because otherwise we have, for instance, reports from Secretary General of the Council of Europe. We are doing the UN Human Rights Council resolutions, and they are all capturing the human rights aspects of the situation on ground. But that has been an endeavor that had a temporary access and not a permanent access or a regular access, which is a part of the demand. I think what we shall continue to do are several things. One is, of course, what we do already in Geneva, ask for international human rights mechanism access on ground. And we have and had been contemplating and still are with co-chairs, because that can have multiple forms. Not one organization, could be mixed, it could be missions, it could be something that is stationed on ground and permanently serves as a focal point. We try to help the ombudsman, for instance, cooperation on both sides, as much of this talk here was also related of how to engage with non-state actors. de facto authorities, in fact. And despite your question was not about it, am I allowed, Mr. Chairman of this panel, to comment on something that I feel is important also to be addressed in terms of a dialogue, and how, because it also involves human rights, but not only. There are a spectrum of issues, including, for instance, trade, that Natalia rightly mentioned, and I should have mentioned that she personally and the organization International Alert has contributed a lot in the run-up to this initiative, because we indeed had a lot of exchange. I think 7 or 8 rounds, if I remember correctly, between Georgians and Abkhaz, including those who represented de facto authorities, but we all had it at expert level, and there was a good vibration. Here is, the person who has steered these discussions, and a lot of understanding when the environment was depoliticized. But this is not a singular thing. The dialogue, we are keen for dialogue. The problem is not on the Georgian side not to sort the dialogue with de facto authorities. We've seen it in the past. We understand there are several forms, including for an initiative, A Step to a Better Future. It's an unwritten chapter, literally. It was written and then on purpose taken away to leave the flexibility on those parties who would want to engage into discussion of how to do that. But there is an offer to engage in dialogue and sort many things through the dialogue, whether it's through the authorized experts or people, like for instance in Cyprus or elsewhere, or whether it's through groups, working groups, international organization or so. Problem is the force that tries to hamper every time we sort the dialogue. And I have live examples of that. You mentioned in your introduction that in these last years the Georgian, Abkhazian and Georgian Ossetian relations worsen. If I may slightly disagree with you, what worsens is the situation on ground. I would challenge that, because we don't have a major breakthrough, which we need at one point in terms of reconciliation and solid ground for trust, but the relations, contacts, multiple, they improve. I can't cite to you every single meeting I'm having in the course of only 1 year since the initiative was published. But trust me, there are more than we had like in the last 5 years. And in the annual report, I even gave the numbers, not only for personally my meetings with some people, including from different de facto affiliations, but also the others, experts, NGOs who did that, my colleagues in my office, people who understand trade, finances. So that is going on. The problem is that every contact is blackmailed directly. Sometimes people are persecuted. The way out is to have more of it. Exactly like with healthcare. When there were 10 people in the first year when we started the free healthcare program, those 10 people could not return to Abkhazia. Some of them live here in the outskirts of Tbilisi. I just met a son, one of the families who is deeply traumatized. Of course, traumatized. But now we have thousands of them. And when there are many people already resorting to what their rational interest is, of course, the leverages of influencing each and everybody is, even in the hands of Russia, quite minor. This is how we see it. So we are still keen for dialogue. We are still keen for contacts. And this is why I said, and they understand that there is a potential. When you said if there are any room of maneuver, these conflicts here are pretty unique. Every conflict is. But trust me, the potential, despite the very bad things that happened, the conflicts that should never have happened, the bloodshed that, of course, alienate people, the resources of reconciliation between the people such as Georgian Abkhaz and Georgian Ossetian, who are pretty close and much closer than both together with the Russians, if you wish, is a very strong resource of reconciliation. This is why we want to capitalize on that.
Thank you, Minister. If I could return to just the question of the report, because as I understand it, it was widely reported in the media that the author of the report, or the co-author, Mr. Hammerberg, who I understand was the Commissioner for Human Rights for the Council of Europe for 6 years, he said what is interesting is that they, by they he meant the European Union, they back off under pressure even from an EU non-member state. It's not a good sign. They broke their promise. What do you think? Does it explain anything about the dynamics of
the EU's relationship with its partners in the Caucasus?
Give me a microphone.
Oh, you don't have a microphone, sorry.
Well, first of all, I can hide behind the fact that I was not in this job at that time, but no, I think the report was published.
By the authors.
The report was published by the authors. It was published on the Olof Palme Center's website. Now, there were certain political aspects to the report, which I think at that time the EU felt it was prudent to also listen to the sensitivities that our Georgian partners have in this regard. But the fact is that the report is out there. The substance of the report is out there, is known to everybody. I think the important is the message that report sends about the responsibility of the de facto authorities regarding human rights, regarding various aspects of how you are supposed to treat people under your control. But there again, I think we come into this gray area as to who is in control, and I think there are, as we know, there are different opinions and views. There are those who say that the Russians are in complete control and therefore it's their role. There are others who say that the de facto authorities do have a role to play in this regard. I think probably the truth is somewhere in between, and what the minister was saying about the real interest in this program, that is indeed very encouraging, and that is why we are supporting this. I think the question is that the weight of history has to be taken off, or at least the weight has to be lessened a bit, and that weight of the conflicts that have happened not only between Georgia and Russia, but between Georgians and Abkhaz, I think that has to be, in one way, shape, or another, addressed, and it will create a lot more space, a sense of common, because this is, I think, the way we're approaching it sometimes, or it's approached sometimes, is that we are looking at this as or I think some people are looking at it as if we talk about the Georgian-Abkhaz conflict, we are letting know. I think it's quite the opposite. I think, in fact, by creating this common space for Georgians and Abkhaz to talk about a common history, you are creating a bigger dividing line between Georgians, Abkhaz, and the Russians, by signaling that even those in Abkhazia, and there are those in Abkhazia who say that we need to have the Russians here because we need their protection from the Georgians, these people will start changing their tune. And I think that will increase the number of people who will say, hey, look at the other side of the Inguri River, how well things are going there, and why can't we have some of that? And forget about those Russians. We don't need them here. We don't want them here. We want to have what they are having on the other side. But again, I think we need to look at how to create this kind of space.
Thank you very much. And looking at the questions again that have presented themselves, I can see two at least strands. One is essentially how successful Georgian government policies have been. How have they been received? Is there a way of measuring it? So, for example, one of the most popular questions here is, Is the issuing of Georgian passports for Abkhazians and South Ossetians helping? Have many people started the process? And I remember, for example, the neutral status travel documents which were issued some years ago. I think 12 countries have signed up to that process. I think it's been stuck at 12 for some time. It seems to have lost momentum. But is there any sense of the take-up of these policies? You gave the statistic, for example, of 140 students in your presentation. Perhaps you could address that. And also, I just see another element here, which somebody here mentions, the case of Moldova, Transnistria. And I say I have an intimate knowledge of this because I came from Chisinau, Moldova, to here. I visit Transnistria regularly, and I can confirm what this questioner is saying, that there's freedom of movement across the conflict divide. And of course, Russia is the major player in this conflict as well. But I think the questioner is asking, why is the situation far worse here? And it seems to be, there's a real negotiation process. There's been many breakthroughs on practical levels. Why is it more successful there? And that leads to a broader question, I guess, because again, I'm conscious of time, so I'm looking to everybody to intervene in these questions which are inspired by these. But are there any kind of successful models that you have encountered or that you look to that you say this could work here, or even aspects of those models? I just throw that out to the panel, and as I said, whoever wants to jump in, please do.
I would jump in, but I'm talking for
Well, I would address the last one about successful cases. I would suggest that there are no permanently successful cases until the peace agreement is reached between the primary parties. And even after, sadly, we have statistics in the world that about 40% of conflicts that had ended with the peace agreement relapse into another war within the next 5 years. So it's like a Sisyphus labor. It's not a final and finite success, because all these conflicts are affected by the trades around, by the regional situation, by the oil prices and million other factors. Therefore, the best advice that I could give, and it's very easy in my capacity to do, is to make sure that success is incremental and sustainable. And this is the key thing: how to make the small things sustainable. How to make the next step starting from this success and not to go back. And this is what we observe, unfortunately, in many conflict situations. So this requires a holistic and systemic approach to all peace efforts. It's easy to say, difficult to do, but this is the only way. For instance, one last example about Kosovo and Serbia. Many people, including in Kosovo and in Serbia, consider the technical dialogue that was facilitated by the European Union, technical dialogue between Pristina and Belgrade about customs, about freedom of movement, about car plates and all this mobile phones, etc., a big success, because eventually, without touching on the issue of a status, the sides signed, and these are not public documents, by the way, signed agreements that enabled proper legal trade, transit, transport, freedom of movement, etc., etc. At the same time, some others think that it was not a success because the final peace agreement hasn't been reached. And surprise, surprise, so many years or decades later, we have a new proposition regarding the conflict resolution, which is a territorial swap, something that no one has spoken about for the last, 25 years. And here we have a division within the European Union with regard to this proposal, although the two leaders were fine with that, and the EU as a general is fine with that, but however, for instance, Germany is very much against creating, reshaping borders according to ethnicity, right? It's like a big taboo for some countries in Europe. So things are changing, and new opportunities may emerge, something that no one has even thought about. But it's an endless and permanent effort.
What about the peace agreement? Yes, we, for example, have a peace agreement about the conflict in Donbass. It didn't stop anyone to go on with a conflict. What I can say is that getting back to the human rights or violation of international humanitarian law, as more of them happen, it's more likely that conflict will continue. It just feeds the conflict. And if the side starts to obliged with the rules, so they more likely would have a better position than in the negotiations and a longer lasting peace later on. And another point I wanted to say, it's nothing going to happen quickly. There is not going to happen any quick resolution. It's about working with the mindsets. It's about changing the approaches and about educating people. For us, for example, we work quite a lot with different weapon bearers and militaries, educating them, convincing them why they should improve their behavior. And it takes years and years. Like, just give you one example. We work in Western Sahara with the Front Polisario, this Polisario Front. In 2005, they signed our deed of commitment on the ban of anti-personnel mines, when we could convince them that there is more civilian victims who suffer from this, civilians who suffer. January this year, it was the final destruction of their stockpile of anti-personnel mines. So it took 13 years, but still, it's already gave some kind of, it helped to calm down the situation on the ground. There is less people who suffer all the time. There is more chance of a talk now than before.
No, of course. I mean, and I think in Ireland we like to say that peace is a process. It's not an event, and there's no kind of magic formula. Minister, you're very popular because a lot of the questions that are the most popular here are directed to you. So, in addition to what has already been said, you might take into account these two very popular questions. The first is taking into account two occupied regions and the fact that Georgian citizens need visas to enter Russia. Should Georgia keep visa-free regime for Russia? And the second one is, in my trips to Abkhazia, I've seen no indication that Abkhaz view Georgia positively or would consider reintegration. How does the Georgian government plan to change this?
Well, you gave me many questions, four of them.
And I have to, unfortunately, these are such weighty issues, but I'm also looking at the organizer. We are short of time.
Yeah. Well, with Russia and visas, and is it stupid? I don't think it's stupid. No, it's not. And we don't always reciprocate Russia with what they do. Imagine if we always did what the Russians do in response. That wouldn't be a nice picture. I think it's a wise policy, but of course, you know, the burden of irresponsibility is on the Russia side. They are not singling themselves out with a policy that is evolved around human interests whatsoever. The last question was about the mindsets, and then you had Moldova and Georgian passports, so I tried to kind of pack it together.
Please, thank you.
So, why Moldova and Georgia situations are different? Again, it can be very short. I can name Russia, one word, Russia, this row, yes. Or I can give you a little bit extended answer. I was, I think last year, some November or so in Moldova. By the way, we have signed a memorandum of cooperation with my Moldovan and Ukrainian colleagues in December here in Tbilisi, but we had kind of a few exchange visits to compare the pages, share the experience, because we all understand that there are so many commonalities in what's happening now in our countries. And in Moldova, when I was standing on that bridge, you know, bridging the rest of Moldova with Transnistria, I had a very strange feeling of a déjà vu of our situation prior to 2008. I would even say in the direction of Abkhazia, maybe early 2000s or late 90s or so, where Russians were still standing with their so-called blue helmets, which were never blue, really. And it took them a second to take it off and turn into a regular army in 2008. And we don't want this scenario, of course, for Moldova, but there are many different contexts, and I think it will take a long time to explain how and what. There is one difference also that comes to, for instance, what we are now talking trade, which functions in the case of Transnistria and Moldova, and they're now working on how to take a full benefit of Moldova's DCFTA, which is an offer from our side now to the residents of Abkhazia and South Ossetia regions. There was a question whether Georgians can also benefit. Of course, yes, and whichever passports. Of course, it doesn't single out ethnicities. And this trade was going on, and Transnistria geographically is differently positioned without sharing a boundary line with Russia. And the traditionally textile and industry is there, and most of its economy is dependent now on the exports. So we can go far, but again, reasons are political. It's always about whether Russia, with current status quo, achieves what it wants or not. And this is an answer to, I think, to your question. Whether for Georgian passports, you mentioned status neutral documents. This is one option. The other option is indeed Georgian passport, and part of this peace plan was about easing the procedure for getting the Georgian passport, not the security part, but the procedure for those who are interested. And we did it in February this year. And people who are resorting for it, for instance, to get the visa-free or any other benefits that are linked to the Georgian passport. But for the things that I was talking about, and the novelty of this peace plan is there, we don't need Georgian passport. Those who have it, of course, they can benefit. We have a novel way of identifying people who live in Abkhazia or South Ossetia, Tsikhelashvili region. We don't involve here citizenship per se, for the reasons that we understand. They may want and be persecuted, they may not want and still want to engage in trade. So there are many different ways how it can be tackled. And at the end of the day, we are really committed to find the ways of how to transform the situation, how to build on what we have. And there are some cases that we could now cite worldwide when it comes to conflict resolution. You yourself mentioned that the idea of the European Union and common good saved many of the conflicts, or at least, you manage the conflicts in a way that you can benefit all from this project. Our strive is also about the united European Georgia, which benefits all. And of course, we are fighting for minds and hearts, and trust me, it has already results. This is why Russians are trying to cut these ties. We are fighting for minds and hearts, and I'm sure there will come times when this fight will be successful, only in case if in parallel we are trying to neutralize what Russians do to distract this peaceful fight for reconciliation. And this is a very important message. I conclude with this, and I also hope for our friends to support in this cause that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for heroically trying to answer so many very serious and weighty questions very briefly. Now, I've been informed by the organisers that our time has concluded, but I think what's clear is that, there's a lot of activity around these issues at the Georgian government level, at the EU level, at the civil society level, and hopefully they will bear fruit in the near future. Again, I can say, going back to the Northern Ireland situation, that the moment when we made the breakthrough actually followed some of the darkest days, and let's hope that the same applies here in Georgia. So on that note, let's conclude for lunch. And thanks again to all our panelists. A note of...
I'm the guy for the technical remarks today. The lunch is at the Fellini restaurant. Experienced conference goers in this venue know where that is. All the others just follow the crowd. And because we are a bit behind schedule, we'll reconvene in this room at 2:30.